The chipped porcelain doll. Sighs followed James Rodriguez as he traversed the attic, a sensation not of observation, but of twinty assessment. Dust motes, disturbed by his intrusion, danced in the single shaft of waning sunlight, illuminating a space choked with the relics of generations past. He, inherited the Blackwood estate from an uncle he, scarcely known, a man whispered to have been eccentric. James, a pragmatic man, a fuffady gambler in the truest sense, fundy calculating risk versus reward, so potential profit in the property. Now, breathing in the fuffid foodie, fungal scent of decay, he wondered if he'd miscalculated. The air itself felt heavy, burdened with a silence that pressed upon the eardrums. He began cataloguing the contents for auction, a tedious task, yet necessary. He discovered a stack of journals bound in cracked leather, the script within a spidery, almost illegible hand. The entries detailed the obsessions of his uncle, Silas Blackwood Tundin, not with wealth but with something other. Rituals performed under the new moon, invocations of entities best left undisturbed, and repeated references to a thinning between worlds. James scoffed, attributing it to the ravings of a lonely, isolated man. A black cat, sleek and unnaturally silent, materialized from the shadows, winding around his legs, its emerald eyes fixed on the journals. It hadn't meowed, hadn't made a sound, and James found this lack of feline vocalization profoundly unsettling. He bent to stroke the animal, but it recoiled, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The journals spoke of a specific date, the UE, the asterisk, 27, 4th of October Thufid, marked repeatedly with frantic, desperate strokes. Silas believed that on this night, the veil between realities was at its weakest, allowing passage for things. James dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, yet a prickling sensation at the base of his neck suggested otherwise. He continued reading, finding increasingly disturbing accounts of spectral apparitions, whispers in the dark, and a growing sense of dread that consumed his uncle. Silas claimed to have opened a door, a conduit to a realm of perpetual twilight, and now something was attempting to come through. He found a hidden compartment within a decaying writing desk, revealing a tarnished silver locket. Inside, a miniature portrait depicted a woman with hauntingly familiar eyes, eye-humptied eyes that mirrored the unsettling gaze of the porcelain doll. The cat, now perched atop a grandfather clock, continued to watch him, its body rigid with tension. James felt a coldness seep into his bones, a premonition of something terrible about to unfold. The air grew thick, almost viscous, and the shadows in the attic seemed to deepen, to fort-breathe. He attempted to rationalize it, to attribute it to fatigue and the oppressive atmosphere, but the growing sense of unease was undeniable. The final journal entry was a single, scrawled sentence. It sees me even now through her eyes. James glanced back at the portrait, then at the doll, and a horrifying realization dawned upon him. The woman in the locket wasn't teat a memory, she was a vessel, a conduit, and the doll wasn't teat merely an object, it was a focus. The cat emitted a strangled yowl, leaping from the clock and disappearing into the darkness, leaving James alone with the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent. He felt a dampness on his hand, not sweat, but a slick, cold residue. The porcelain doll was weeping black tears. The black residue on James Rodriguez's palm felt less like a liquid and more like finely ground charcoal, clinging to the skin despite his attempts to wipe it away. He examined the doll again, the porcelain unnaturally smooth, the painted lips curved in a mockery of a smile. The tears, now ceased, had left faint, sooty trails down its cheeks. He catalogued the details, 20, the chipped paint around the eyes, the faded floral pattern of the dress, the unsettling weight of the object in his hands. A purely analytical exercise, he told himself, a means of grounding himself in the face of mounting disquiet. The cat remained absent. Its silence felt more significant than any caterwauling. He descended from the attic, the floorboards groaning under his weight, each creak echoing through the cavernous house. The Blackwood estate wasn't merely old, it felt tired, as if the very structure was weary of its existence. He needed light, a distraction from the oppressive gloom. He located the fuse box in the basement, a damp, earthen-smelling space. The wiring was antiquated, a tangled mess of frayed insulation and corroded connections. He flipped the main switch. Nothing. He tried a secondary breaker, a flicker, then darkness. The emergency flashlight he'd brought revealed a single pulsing red light on the breaker box circuit, a short circuit. He considered calling an electrician, but the nearest town was a considerable distance, and the encroaching night felt urgent. He decided to attempt a temporary fix himself, a calculated risk. As he worked, stripping back a section of damaged wire, he noticed something etched into the concrete floor beneath the breaker box. Symbols. Not haphazard graffiti, but deliberate, intricate designs resembling constellations or something attempting to mimic them. They were covered in a layer of grime, but undeniably present. He traced one with his finger, a coldness radiating from the stone. Returning upstairs, he found the house plunged into an even deeper darkness than before. The single flashlight beam felt inadequate, swallowed by the vastness of the rooms. He attempted to relight the oil lamps scattered throughout the house, but the wicks were dry. The oil reservoirs empty. A systematic depletion, he noted, not mere neglect. He found a box of matches in the kitchen, striking one with a practiced hand. The flame illuminated a small section of the room, revealing a layer of dust so thick it resembled snow, and something else, scratches on the inside of the pantry door. Long, deliberate gouges, as if made by claws. He called out, his voice sounding strangely small in the echoing silence. "Hello!" No response, just the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a measured beat counting down to something unknown. He found a bottle of brandy in the library, a small comfort, and took a measured sip. The alcohol did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within his bones. He resumed his search for functional lamps, moving through the house with a growing sense of dread. The cat remained elusive, a phantom presence just beyond the periphery of his vision. He found a half-eaten plate of fish in the dining room covered in flies. The fish was old, decayed, and arranged in a peculiar pattern, a spiral. The spiral of decaying fish on the dining room table wasn't haphazard. James Rodriguez, kneeling to examine it more closely, recognized the arrangement. It mirrored a symbol from the basement 21 of the etched constellations, albeit a crude approximation. He photographed it, the flash momentarily illuminating the swarm of flies, their bodies glistening with an oily sheen. The smell was acrid, sickening. He resisted the urge to gag. Observation, he reminded himself. Data collection, he wasn't a man prone to superstition, but the confluence of unsettling details was beginning to erode his skepticism. He discovered a pantry stocked not with provisions, but with jars. Hundreds of them filled with a viscous amber liquid, and preserved specimens. Not fruits or vegetables, but animal parts. Tongues, eyes, feathers arranged with a meticulous, almost artistic precision. The glass was clouded with age, but the contents were disturbingly visible. He forced himself to open one, the lid sealed with wax bearing a stylized raven. The smell that escaped was ancient, earthy, and faintly metallic. He quickly resealed it. A wave of nausea washing over him. He found a note tucked beneath the jar, written in the same spidery script as the journals. The offerings must be renewed. They hunger for remembrance. Remembrance, a peculiar choice of words. He pocketed the note, his fingers trembling slightly. The house seemed to be responding to his investigation, growing colder, darker, more oppressive with each discovery. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m., the 27th of October was rapidly approaching. He dismissed the thought as coincidence, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. He attempted to contact the local authorities, but the phone lines were dead. No dial tone, no signal. He tried his mobile. The same result, isolated. Cut off. He wasn't surprised. Logically, the Blackwood estate was situated in a remote area, prone to outages, but the timing felt intentional. He moved to the library, hoping to find a map, a way to reach the nearest town on foot. The room was dominated by a massive fireplace, the hearth, filled with cold ash. Above the mantelpiece hung a portrait of Silas Blackwood, his uncle. The painting was unsettlingly lifelike, the eyes seeming to follow James as he moved. He noticed something odd about the portrait. A faint discoloration on the canvas, beneath the layers of paint. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling a subtle indentation. He examined it closely, realizing it was a hidden compartment inside. A small, leather-bound book, not a journal, but a grimoire, filled with diagrams, incantations, and warnings. He opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the archaic text. A phrase caught his attention. The Keeper of the Threshold demands tribute. Silence is its preferred currency. He slammed the book shut, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread gripping him. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and then he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls. The scratching wasn't the skittering of rodents. James Rodriguez, pressing his ear against the aged plaster of the hallway wall, identified a deliberate rhythm to the sound, a scraping, dragging motion, as if something was attempting to excavate. He moved slowly, flashlight beam dancing across the faded wallpaper towards the source of the noise. It emanated from the wall behind a large, ornate mirror. A mirror that, upon closer inspection, wasn't reflecting his image accurately. The distortion was subtle, a blurring of the edges, a slight elongation of his features. As if the glass wasn't quite solid. He tried to lift the mirror, but it was heavier than it appeared, secured to the wall with rusted iron brackets. He strained, muscles protesting, and finally managed to dislodge it. Behind it wasn't wall, but a narrow passage, a crudely constructed tunnel barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The air emanating from within was frigid, carrying a scent of damp earth and something else, something akin to burnt sugar. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, revealing a winding, claustrophobic space. The scratching intensified. Closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural humming. He hesitated. A rational man wouldn't enter. A gambler, however, assessed the odds. The potential for answers, however terrifying, outweighed the risk. He took a deep breath and began to crawl, the rough stone scraping against his knees and elbows. The tunnel sloped downwards, the air growing colder with each foot. The humming resonated in his skull, a discordant drone that seemed to vibrate his very bones. He noticed markings on the tunnel walls, the same symbols as in the basement, and on the dining room table etched into the stone with a sharp instrument. They pulsed faintly in the beam of his flashlight, as if illuminated from within. He rounded a bend, and the tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. In the center stood a stone altar, stained with a dark, viscous substance, and on the altar, arranged with a grotesque precision, were the porcelain doll and the portrait of the woman from the locket. The doll's eyes were open, fixed on the entrance. The woman in the portrait was smiling, a genuine, unsettling smile that hadn't been present before. The scratching had stopped. The humming had ceased. A profound silence descended, broken only by the frantic beating of James's heart. He noticed something else. A small wooden cage in the corner of the chamber, empty, but the bars were bent outwards, as if something had forced its way out, and scattered around the cage were feathers. Black feathers. The same feathers he'd seen preserved in the jars in the pantry. He reached for his phone, intending to document the scene, but the device was dead. Completely drained of power, he glanced back towards the tunnel entrance. A shadow flickered at the periphery of his vision, and then he saw it. A pair of emerald eyes glowing in the darkness. The cat. But it wasn't looking footy him. It was looking footy pasty him. The cat didn't move, didn't blink. Its gaze remained fixed on the space behind James Rodriguez, a point just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. He slowly turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the small pocket knife he carried. The chamber was circular, offering no immediate hiding place. Yet, the air itself felt distorted, as if the very geometry of the room was subtly shifting. He swept the flashlight across the stone walls, the beam trembling slightly. Nothing. Just the unsettling arrangement on the altar, and the empty cage. He returned his attention to the cat, attempting to decipher its silent warning. The animal's fur was bristled, its body coiled like a spring. It emitted a low growl, a sound devoid of any feline warmth, a sound of pure, primal fear. James followed the cat's gaze again, focusing on the area behind him. And then he saw it. Not a figure, not a shape, but a lack of something. A patch of darkness that wasn't merely shadow, but an absence of light, a void that seemed to absorb the surrounding illumination. He shone the flashlight directly at the anomaly, but the beam seemed to dissipate, swallowed by the darkness. It wasn't a physical obstruction. It was as if a section of reality had been removed. He took a step back, bumping into the stone altar. The doll teetered precariously, then fell, shattering on the stone floor, the porcelain fragments scattered like bone shards. The woman in the portrait remained undisturbed, her smile unwavering. As the doll broke, a sound echoed through the chamber. Not a crash, but a sigh, a long drawn-out exhalation of air, as if a great weight had been lifted. The darkness behind him began to coalesce, to take form. It wasn't a monstrous shape, not a grotesque apparition. It was a silhouette, a human form, vaguely defined, shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply foi a presence, an absence made manifest. James attempted to speak, to demand an explanation, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a tightening sensation that made it difficult to breathe. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something floral, sickly sweet. He noticed a detail about the silhouette. It was wearing a dress, a faded floral dress, identical to the one on the porcelain doll. The cat finally broke its silence, emitting a piercing shriek. It leaped forward, not at the silhouette, but at James, claws extended. He instinctively raised his arm to defend himself, and the cat connected, raking across his forearm. The pain was sharp, searing, but it wasn't the physical wound that terrified him. It was the cat's eyes. They were no longer emerald green. They were black, completely black, and filled with an ancient, knowing dread. The silhouette began to drift forward, its form solidifying, and James realized with chilling certainty that he wasn't facing a ghost. He was facing a reflection. The pain in James Rodriguez's forearm was secondary to the icy dread that had seized his limbs. He stared at the cat, its black eyes boring into his soul, and understood. The animal hadn't attacked him randomly. It had been forewarning him, not from a threat outside, but from one within. The silhouette continued to materialize, resolving into the form of a woman, the woman from the portrait, the woman from the doll. Her features were no longer blurred, no longer indistinct. They were sharp, defined, and disturbingly familiar. She wasn't a specter, not an ethereal being. She was solid, real, and her eyes, a startling shade of gray, held no warmth, no recognition. Only a hollow emptiness. She wore the faded floral dress, stained with what appeared to be dried mud and something darker, something viscous. Her lips parted, and she spoke. Her voice a dry rasp, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You shouldn't have disturbed my rest." James attempted to speak, to formulate a coherent question, but his tongue felt thick and unresponsive. He managed a strangled whisper. Who are you?" The woman didn't answer directly. She simply tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over him with an unnerving scrutiny. "Silas spoke of you, the inheritor, the one who would unlock the door." He glanced around the chamber, desperately searching for an escape route. The tunnel was too narrow, the walls too smooth. He was trapped. He noticed a detail about the woman's hands. They were translucent, almost ethereal, but her fingernails were long, sharp, and stained with the same dark substance as the altar. She extended one hand, her fingers brushing against the shattered porcelain of the doll. "He promised me a vessel, a new form, and you, James Rodriguez, are the key." He understood now. The rituals, the offerings, the symbol. It wasn't about summoning a demon or contacting a spirit. It was about transference, about inhabiting a living body, about escaping a prison of stone and shadow. He took a step back, bumping into the altar, sending the remaining fragments of the doll tumbling to the floor. The woman didn't react. She simply continued to advance, her movements slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. The cat, still crouched on the floor, began to emit a low, guttural growl. It wasn't defending James, it was protecting something else. He followed the cat's gaze and saw it. A small wooden box hidden beneath the altar. He reached for it, ignoring the searing pain in his forearm, and managed to pull it free. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver amulet, a simple design funnied a raven in flight. He instinctively clasped it around his neck. As the amulet touched his skin, a surge of energy coursed through his body. A wave of heat washed over him, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, the woman had stopped advancing. She stood frozen, her grey eyes narrowed in fury. And for the first time, James Rodriguez saw a flicker of fear in her gaze. The amulet felt cold against James Rodriguez's skin, a stark contrast to the burning sensation that had momentarily engulfed him. The woman's stillness wasn't peace, but calculation. She studied him, her grey eyes dissecting his every movement, assessing the change. "A ward," she rasped, her voice laced with venom. Silas was resourceful, but it won't hold for long. He didn't respond. He needed time. Time to understand what the amulet was, what it protected him from. He glanced at the cat, which had ceased growling, and was now watching the woman with an unnerving intensity. Its black eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. The animal wasn't merely observing, it was took-eat. He noticed a subtle tremor in the woman's form, a flickering distortion around her edges. The amulet was disrupting her manifestation, weakening her hold on this reality. He tried to recall the contents of the grimoire, searching for any mention of the amulet or the woman. He remembered a passage describing a keeper of the threshold, a being bound to the Blackwood estate by an ancient pact. A being who required a vessel to maintain its existence. Silas Blackwood, he realized, hadn't been merely eccentric. He'd been a warden, a guardian tasked with containing something far more sinister. And now that containment was failing. The woman began to speak again, her voice regaining its strength. The amulet is a temporary reprieve. It will delay the inevitable, but it cannot prevent it. I have waited centuries for this, for a body strong enough to withstand the transition. Your bloodline is suitable. She took a step forward, and James instinctively raised his arm, the amulet pressing against his chest. He felt a surge of power, a tingling sensation that spread through his limbs. He noticed a detail about the woman's reflection in the polished stone floor. It wasn't mirroring her movements accurately. There was a lag, a slight delay between her actions and her image, as if she wasn't fully anchored to this reality. He seized the opportunity, lunging forward and grabbing a handful of the dark, viscous substance from the altar. It felt cold and clammy against his skin, smelling of decay and something metallic. He threw it at the woman. The substance splattered against her dress, and she recoiled with a scream. Not a shriek of pain, but a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The amulet pulsed with energy, and the woman's form began to flicker more violently. Her features distorted, her body contorting into grotesque shapes. The air crackled with static electricity. The cat hissed, arching its back and spitting. He realized the substance wasn't merely a stain. It was a deterrent, a repellent, something that weakened her connection to this world. He grabbed another handful and threw it again, and again until the woman was covered in the dark, viscous goo. Her screams intensified, echoing through the chamber, and then with a final agonizing shriek, she began to dissolve. Not into nothingness, but into shadow. The dissolution wasn't clean. The woman didn't simply vanish. She fragmented, her form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that writhed and pulsed against the stone walls of the chamber. The viscous substance seemed to accelerate the process, eating away at her substance like acid on flesh. The air filled with a cloying, sickly sweet odor, and the temperature plummeted. James Rodriguez, coated in the repellent, stood trembling, the amulet radiating a faint warmth against his chest. The tendrils of shadow began to coalesce to reform, but not into the woman's original shape. Instead, they twisted and contorted into grotesque parodies of human anatomy, food and elongated limbs, distorted faces, gaping maws filled with needle-sharp teeth. They writhed and flailed, bumping against the walls, the ceiling, the altar, a chaotic amorphous mass of darkness. The cat, now a silent, watchful sentinel, remained motionless, its black eyes fixed on the swirling shadows. He realized the woman hadn't been destroyed. She'd been dispersed, broken into fragments, and those fragments were now attempting to reassemble themselves to find new anchors, new points of entry. He scanned the chamber, desperately searching for a way to contain the chaos. His gaze fell upon the empty cage. It was made of iron, reinforced with intricate carvings. A containment vessel, he lunged for the cage, ignoring the searing pain in his forearm, and began to drag it towards the center of the chamber. The shadows lashed out, attempting to impede his progress, but the amulet seemed to deflect their attacks. He managed to position the cage directly beneath the swirling mass of darkness, and then, acting on instinct, he began to chant. Not a specific incantation, but a rhythmic, guttural sound, a primal utterance that resonated with the energy of the amulet. The sound seemed to amplify the amulet's power, creating a field of energy around the cage. The shadows recoiled, hesitant to cross the threshold. He continued chanting, his voice growing stronger, more resonant. The shadows writhed and pulsed, their movements becoming increasingly frantic. And then, slowly, reluctantly, they began to drift towards the cage. It wasn't a passive surrender. The shadows fought against the pull, resisting the containment. They lashed out at James, attempting to overwhelm him with their icy touch. He gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy on maintaining the chant, on strengthening the amulet's ward. The cat let out a piercing shriek, leaping onto the cage and clawing at the bars, as if urging him on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the shadows were drawn into the cage. The bars rattled and groaned under the strain, but they held. The chamber fell silent, the air thick with the scent of decay and ozone. James collapsed to his knees, exhausted and trembling. The amulet pulsed weakly against his chest. He looked at the cage, now filled with a writhing, amorphous mass of darkness. It wasn't over, it was merely contained. The cage didn't offer solace, merely a temporary reprieve. James Rodriguez, leaning against the cold stone wall, observed the contained darkness. It wasn't static. The mass within shifted and pulsed, occasionally sending out tendrils of shadow that pressed against the iron bars, testing their strength. He could feel a subtle vibration in the floor, a rhythmic thrumming that resonated with the cage. A heartbeat. He examined the amulet, turning it over in his hands. It was crafted from tarnished silver, depicting a raven in flight, its wings outstretched. He noticed a faint inscription on the back, written in a language he didn't recognize. He photographed it with his phone, hoping to translate it later, but the device remained stubbornly unresponsive. The battery was inexplicably drained. He needed to understand the history of the Blackwood estate, the nature of the entity he'd contained. He returned to the library, hoping to find more information in Silas Blackwood's journals. The room felt colder than before, the air thick with an oppressive silence. He located the stack of journals, their leather covers cracked and brittle. He began to read, scanning the spidery script with a growing sense of dread. The journals revealed a lineage steeped in occultism, a family history of pacts and sacrifices. Silas Blackwood hadn't been merely a warden. He'd been a descendant of a long line of guardians, tasked with containing the entity, a being known as the Umbra, a creature of pure shadow, born from the void between worlds. The amulet, he learned, was a key component of the containment ritual, a focus for channeling the energy needed to bind the Umbra. Silas had discovered that the Umbra wasn't merely a mindless entity. It possessed a cunning intelligence, a malevolent will. It could influence dreams, manipulate perceptions, and exploit weaknesses. It sought a vessel, a host body, to escape its prison and wreak havoc upon the world. The woman he'd faced hadn't been the Umbra itself, but a fragment, a projection of its consciousness. He found a disturbing entry detailing a ritual Silas had performed to strengthen the containment field, a ritual that required a sacrifice. Not a human sacrifice, but a sacrifice of memory. Silas had willingly erased portions of his own past, severing ties to his loved ones in order to bolster the amulet's power. James realized with a chilling certainty that he was facing a threat far greater than he'd imagined. He glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. The hands were frozen at midnight. He felt a prickling sensation at the base of his neck, a sense of being watched. He turned slowly and saw the cat, standing in the doorway, its black eyes fixed on him. But it wasn't alone. Standing behind the cat, shrouded in shadow, was a figure, a familiar figure, Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood wasn't a ghost. Not precisely. He was faded, a spectral echo, his form translucent, his features blurred at the edges. He moved with a disconcerting fluidity, as if unbound by the laws of physics. His eyes, devoid of pupils, fixed on James Rodriguez with an unnerving intensity. The cat, surprisingly, didn't react. It remained motionless, a silent observer. "You've done well to contain it, for a time," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp, like the rustling of parchment. "But the Umbra is patient. It will find a way." He didn't approach, didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood in the doorway, assessing James with a detached, clinical gaze. "The amulet is a temporary solution. It requires constant replenishment, a sacrifice of essence." James understood immediately. The same sacrifice Silas had made, a relinquishing of memories of identity, a gradual erosion of self. He shook his head. "No, I won't." Silas tilted his head, a flicker of amusement crossing his spectral features. "You have no choice. The Umbra feeds on willpower, on resistance. The more you fight, the stronger it becomes. The amulet demands a toll, and if you refuse to pay, it will take it from you anyway, slowly, painfully." He glanced at the caged darkness, the pulsing shadows a constant reminder of the threat. He knew Silas spoke the truth. The amulet wasn't a shield, it was a parasite, a symbiotic bond that demanded a price. He looked at the cat, seeking some sign of hope, some indication of a path forward. The animal remained impassive, its black eyes reflecting the darkness within the cage. Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "There is another way, a permanent solution, a transference. Allow the Umbra to inhabit your body, become its vessel. It will grant you power, knowledge beyond your comprehension. You will become something more." James felt a surge of nausea. The Umbra hadn't wanted a body to escape. It wanted a body to fulvive, to transcend its limitations. He understood now. The woman, the rituals, the sacrifices. It wasn't about containment, it was about ascension. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He knew he couldn't win. He couldn't defeat the Umbra, but he could choose how he lost. He could surrender, become a puppet, a vessel for darkness, or he could fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Silas's. "I choose to remember," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and as he spoke, he felt a searing pain in his chest, a tearing sensation as the amulet began to drain his memories, his identity. The world around him dissolved into a swirling vortex of darkness. The last thing he saw before oblivion claimed him was the cat, its black eyes no longer empty but filled with a profound, unsettling sadness. The cage rattled, and then silence, a silence deeper and more absolute than any he had known before. The Blackwood estate had claimed another soul, and the Umbra had found its vessel.